Hello everyone, this is Varun and you are watching my channel En route IAS. Now coming to Indian polity. Indian polity is a very important subject for UPSC prelims as well as for UPSC mains, because the number of questions asked in UPSC prelims is around 12 to 14 on an average out of 100 questions of general studies. So this makes it a huge chunk of questions that are being asked from this subject, and this number can go up to 18 to 20 also. This makes this subject very important for you. Secondly, the type of question asked are usually of moderate type only, so it's easier to score in this part. Therefore studying this part in detail is very important. So what I will be doing is that I will be covering the polity syllabus in detail, and this is the first video of polity. I will be uploading more videos subsequently. So what I will be doing is that I will be taking a whole chapter at a go, or in some cases I will break the chapter into 2 or 3 parts, because if the chapter is very long then the video will become very long. I will be covering all those concepts that are usually asked in the exam, and in the end I will give some sample questions also, which will let you know as to the type of question that are usually asked on polity. So this is the first video of Indian polity, and I will be covering the historical background of all the acts passed from 1773 to 1947. 1773 was a time when companies rule started in India, and 1947 was the time when Act of Indian Independence was passed. Now what I will do is that I will be covering the important points of these acts in this video. I will not be giving a detailed discussion, because detailed discussion will be given in subsequent videos that will come in subsequent chapters. So if you like my videos, then please subscribe to my page En route IAS. My Facebook page is also same, En route IAS, as well as my Facebook group, that is En route IAS. If you want to join my Facebook group, you can join my group En route IAS. Secondly, I have a website enrouteias.com. Over there I will be uploading all these videos and the study material. You can watch these videos, and you can also download the study material from my website. If you have any question asked, or you have any query, you can directly mail me, and my mail ID is varunsharma398@gmail.com. Now coming to the way forward. So as we have already discussed that in this video I will be covering all the important acts that were passed between 1773 to 1947. This period can again be broken into 3 more parts. These parts are: the first one is the company rule. The company rule started in 1773 and ended in 1858. This was the time during which the East India Company ruled over India. This period ended after the first struggle for Indian independence. After this, the Indian rule directly came under the crown. So the second period was the crown rule, that is from 1858 to 1947. After this we gained our freedom, and first act of Indian independence was passed in 1947. So I will be covering all the acts during these periods in details in the subsequent slides. So let us start with the first phase, that is the company rule. The company rule was started in 1773 and it ended in 1858. During this period, 4 important acts were passed. The first act was the Regulating Act of 1773. The important points of this act were: first of all, this was the first step taken by the British government to control the East India Company. Secondly, this act for the first time recognized the political and administrative function of the company. The third point, which is very important, is that it designated the Governor of Bengal as the Governor General of Bengal. This is a very important point, and it has already been asked in previous exams that which act designated the Governor of Bengal as the Governor General of Bengal. Also, sometimes it is asked that who was the first Governor General of Bengal. So you must remember the first Governor General of Bengal was Lord Warren Hastings. Remember this name, this is very important. Another important point is that it made the Bombay and Madras presidencies subordinate to the Bengal presidency. This was the first step towards decentralization, as it made the Bombay and the Madras presidency subordinate to the Bengal presidency. This is a very important point and can be asked in the exam. Also, it established the Supreme Court at Calcutta in 1774. So this is also a very important point, and it can be asked in the exam. 2 more points were that it prohibited the servants of the company from engaging in the private trade. Though this point is not very important, but still you must go through it. The second important point is the board of directors were to report to the British government regarding the revenue, civil and the military affairs. This point is also not very important, but you must go through this point at least once. Now coming to the second act. The second act was the Pitt's India Act and it was passed in 1784. The important points of this act were it distinguished between the political and the commercial functions of the company. Secondly, it was very important because British government was given supreme control over the company through this act. The most important point in this act is that the company's territories in India were for the first time called as British possessions in India. So this is a very important question that can come. That is, which act made the company's territories as British possession in India? So you must remember that it was the Pitt's India Act. Now coming to the next act. Next act was the Charter Act of 1833. The important points of this act were it designated the Governor General of Bengal to Governor General of India. So this is very important. Initially in the regulating act you can see that the Governor General of Bengal was Governor of Bengal was called as Governor General of Bengal. But now the same Governor General of Bengal is called Governor General of India and he was also given civil and military powers. So you can see that governor is getting more and more powers. The first Governor General of India was William Bentinck. Similar to Lord Warren Hastings, you must also remember this name also because this has been asked in the past. It might be again asked in the exam. This was the first government of India. Another important point was that from now on the laws were to be called as acts. Initially in the Regulating Act and the Pitt's India Act, these laws were called regulations. But now these laws were to be called as act. Do not confuse them with the names. Regulating Act and Pitt's India Act are basically names of act, but the laws made under these acts were called regulations. Do not confuse them with acts. The laws were called acts only after the Chartered Act 1833 onwards. So remember this point, this is very important. Another important point was that it deprived the Bombay and Madras presidencies of legislative powers. Initially, you can see in the Regulating Act, they were made subordinate to the Bengal presidencies, but now their legislative powers has also been taken away. So this is further centralization of powers by the British government. The company's activities ended as a commercial body and it became an administrative body. Though this point is not very important, but you must go through this point once. The next act that was passed was Charter Act of 1853. The important points of the Charter Act were it separated the legislative and the executive function of the Governor General's Executive Council. This is a very important point, can be easily asked in the exam that which act separated for the first time separated the legislative and executive function of the Governor General's Executive Council. So you must remember this point. Initially what happened was that the legislative and the executive functions were being performed by the same body itself, but the boundaries were not clearly demarcated. Now the functions were clearly demarcated. So this is an important point. Another important point was that the legislative wing, that is the legislative wing of the Governor General's Executive Council, functioned as the mini parliament as the parliament used to work in the British government, that is in Britain. So this was acting like a mini parliament and was emulating the functions that are performed by the British Parliament. So this is also a very important point. The most important point over here is that it introduced the system of open competition for civil servants, and for that Macaulay Committee was made in 1854. So remember this committee, this is very important, that which committee for the first time was made for the civil servants. You must remember that it was the Macaulay Committee and it was made in 1854. Another important point was that since now since centralization was being done by the government, but the government also wanted to give representation to the local provincial government also. So it introduced a system of local representatives in the Governors General's Central Legislative Council, the council which was to make laws for whole India. So they elected, and from now onwards, out of the 6 members in this council, 4 to be elected by the Madras, Bombay, Bengal and the Agra provincial governments. So basically the south, center, east and the northern parts were covered so that they also had equal participation while making the laws. So these were the 4 acts that were passed during the company rule. You must remember that these points such as Governor of Bengal was changed to Governor General of Bengal, Governor General of Bengal was changed to Governor of General of India, and you must also remember who are the first Governor General of India and first Governor General of Bengal. These are very important and these can definitely come in the exam. Now let us come to the second phase, that is the Crown rule. After the end of East India Company rule in India, the Crown took over the administration of India from the East India Company. During the Crown rule, 6 major acts were passed. The acts were, first was the Government of India Act 1858. After this act, 3 Indian Councils Act were passed. They were, the first was Indian Councils Act 1861, the second was Indian Councils Act 1892, and the third was Indian Councils Act 1909. So the Indian Council Act of 1909 was also called Morley Minto Reforms. After that, Government of India Act 1990 was passed, and the last was Government of India Act 1935. So let us discuss the Government of India Act 1858 first. Government of India Act was passed immediately after the first struggle for independence. This act was also called Act for Good Government of India. Remember this thing, this act is called Act for Good Government of India. Now this act abolished the East India Company and transferred the powers to the British Crown. So now East India Company was no longer ruling the country and all the powers were now given to the British Crown. The Governor General of India was changed to Viceroy of India. And the first Viceroy was Lord Canning. As you have already seen in the previous acts, first of all the Governor of Bengal was changed to Governor General of Bengal. Then Governor General of Bengal was changed to Governor General of India. Now Governor General of India has been changed to Viceroy of India. So you must remember in which act these all things were done, and you must also remember who was the first person to be the Governor of Bengal, first person to be the Governor General of Bengal, first person to be the Governor General of India, and first person to be the Viceroy of India. So you must remember all these names. Now it ended the system of double government. This system was introduced in the Pitt's India Act. In that system there were Court of Directors and Board of Control. So the Court of Directors were taking care of commercial issues of India and the Board of Control was responsible for the political issues. But now since there was no East India Company, so the commercial issues were to be taken care of by the British government only. So there was no need of double government system, and so this was abolished. This created a new office of Secretary of State. Secretary of State was basically a member of British cabinet and he was responsible for the Indian administration. So now we can see that now we have two heads who were ruling India. One was the Viceroy of India and second was the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State was directly responsible to the British Parliament so that he could also take care of the rule of India along with Viceroy of India. He was given a 15-member advisory council to assist him. So these all were the important features of this act. After the Government of India Act 1858, 3 Indian Councils Act were passed. The first was Indian Councils Act of 1861. So let us see what were the important features of this act. So the important features of Indian Councils Act of 1861 were as follows. As you must be remembering that we had discussed in the Charter Act of 1853 that the legislative and executive functions were separated. So the governor was given a legislative council, Governor General of India was given a legislative council and a executive council. Similarly, the Viceroy also had a legislative council. But initially the Viceroy's legislative council did not have any Indians. So this act for the first time introduced 3 Indians to the Viceroy legislative council. The 3 Indians were Raja of Benares, Maharaja of Patiala and Sir Dinkar Rao. Now you must be very careful that these 3 Indians for the first time were nominated to the Viceroy Legislative Council and not to the Viceroy's Executive Council. So this is very important. Remember this thing that in 1861, 3 Indians were nominated to Viceroy's Legislative Council, and remember their names also. Secondly, it started the process of decentralization and legislative powers of Bombay and Madras presidencies were given back. As you must be remembering that in the Act of 1833, the powers of Bombay and Madras presidencies were taken away. So at that time, process of centralization was being done. But with this act, again the decentralization had started and the powers of Bombay and Madras presidencies were given back. So you must remember that in this act the powers were given back, and in the act of 1833 the powers were snatched away from these presidencies. Next was it provided for the establishment of new Legislative Council of Bengal, Northwest Frontier Province and Punjab. Next, it gave recognition to the portfolio system by Lord Canning, introduced by Lord Canning in 1859. The portfolio system is nothing but the portfolio system that is being followed in India as of today. You must have seen that Nitin Gadkari is our transport minister, so he is handling the transport portfolio. He can also handle another portfolio if he is given, so he can handle two portfolios or maybe three portfolios at a time. So similarly, this system was introduced in this act, and a member of Viceroy's Council could handle one or more department and make rules on the behalf of council. So this was similar to the portfolio system being followed today. It empowered the Viceroy to make ordinances in case of emergency. So this is also a very important point. You must remember that when was the system of ordinances introduced. The next Indian Councils Act is Indian Councils Act of 1892. So let us discuss the important features of this act. So coming to the important features of Indian Councils Act of 1892. The first important feature was that it increased the number of members in the Legislative Council. Now 16 members could be kept. Earlier the number was 6. It was on the discretion of the governor of the Viceroy to keep 10 to 16 members. So he could keep any number of members he wanted up to 16. Initially there were 6 members, and out of these 6, 3 were Indians. Secondly, it gave power to the Legislative Council to discuss the budget. Initially, the Legislative Council did not have the power to discuss the budget, but this power was given in this act. But this had a condition. The budget could be discussed and questions asked, but voting was not allowed and amendments also could not be made. Now, an important thing happened with this was that Indian National Congress started a agitation against this, and many of the politicians came out with a tagline that was no taxation without representation. So we'll see in the coming act that the Britishers had to give in to this demand, and voting was allowed on the budget also. We'll discuss about that thing later on. Another important point was it provided for the nomination of non-official members to the Central Legislative Council, but this was done on recommendation of provincial councils and Bengal Chamber of Commerce. Secondly, it also provided for the nomination of non-official members to the provincial councils also. So as you must see over here, there were two kinds of council. One was the Central Legislative Council, similar to that of our Parliament of today, and second was the Provincial Council. The Provincial Council was similar to the State Legislative Councils that we have today, though not exactly the same. So basically these provincial councils also could now nominate some of the non-official members. These were some of the important points of Indian Council Act of 1892. Now coming to the third Indian Councils Act of 1909. This act was also called Morley-Minto Reforms. So let us discuss this act in detail. Now coming to some of the important features of Indian Councils Act of 1909. This act was also called Morley-Minto Reforms. Now who were these two, Morley and Minto? So Morley was the Secretary of the State and Lord Minto was Viceroy of India. So as we have already discussed that after the Act of 1858, two people were to rule India. They were Secretary of State, who was to report to the Parliament, and Lord Minto, who was the Viceroy of India. Secondly, it increased the strength of Provincial and Central Legislative Council. For Central Council, the strength was increased from 16 to 60. As we have already seen in the Indian Councils Act of 1892, that the strength was increased from 6 to 16. But now this strength has been again further increased from 16 to 60. For the provincial councils, the strength was not uniform, but it had been increased. In the provincial councils, non-official majority was introduced, but still non-elective members were in majority. So you could see over here, but that non-officials were increased in number, but they were still being nominated, and the elective members were very less. So the non-elected members were still in majority. For the first time, the Indians were allowed to be a part of Executive Council of Governor and Viceroy. Now, this is a very important point, as we have already discussed in the Councils Act of 1861 that three Indians were for the first time allowed into the Legislative Council. But this was the first time that an Indian was allowed into the Executive Council. So you must remember this thing, that those three people, that is Maharaja of Benares, Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao, they were in, for the first time allowed in the Legislative Council. But Satyendra Prasad Sinha was the first person to join the Viceroy Executive Council, and this provision was introduced in the Act of 1909. That provision of entry of Indians into the Legislative Council was introduced in the Act of 1861. You must remember this point. Next, voting on separate items of budget was allowed, but not on the whole budget. So, as we have already discussed in the Act of 1892, that Congress had started demanding voting on the budget, and they had started saying that no taxation without representation. So, the government had to give in to the demands of the Congress, and voting was started in this act, through this act. But whole budget was still not allowed to be voted, but still separate items of budget could be voted now. It also introduced the communal representation for Muslims. This is a very important point, that the communal representation was for the first time introduced in Act of 1909. Actually, from where did this communal representation come from? Mr. Aga Khan led a Shimla deputation, and he met Lord Minto in 1906, and he kept a demand for separate electorate. So from there, this idea came into existence, and it was introduced in the Act of 1909. So you must remember this point, this is very important. So Lord Minto was called the father of communal electorate. You must remember that Lord Minto is called the father of communal electorate. The next important act that was passed was Government of India Act 1919. This was also called Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Now let us see what were the important features of Government of India Act 1919. This act was also called Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Montagu was the Secretary of State at that time, and Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India. Now this separated the provincial and central subjects. So there were some items on which provinces could make rules, and some items on which center could make rules. But remember here that no concurrent subject was given. So remember this thing, that in Act of 1919 only the separation of provincial and central subjects was done. Further, the provincial subjects, that is the subjects which were given to the provinces, were again divided. One was, they were divided into transferred and the reserved subjects. So what were basically the transfer subjects were that on which the governor and the legislative council could make rules, while in case of reserved subjects only the governor and the executive council could make rules. So over here you can see the differentiation, that the legislative council is involved for some subjects, while in case of other subjects the executive council is involved. This system of rule was called diarchy or double rule. Remember this thing, diarchy was introduced in the Government of India Act 1919. This question has been asked many number of times in the exam and can be asked in this exam also. So you must remember this thing, that diarchy or double rule was introduced in the Government of India Act, and you must also know what is the double rule. Secondly, executive councillor were not responsible to the legislature. But over here there is a important thing that you must know, that in case of legislative council, if a no confidence motion was passed, all the people had to resign. But the executive councillors were not responsible to the legislature, therefore a no confidence motion could not be passed against them. It introduced a system of bicameralism. This is also very important point, and this can also be asked, that in which Government of India Act, bicameralism was introduced. Bicameralism is nothing but two houses were introduced. One was the upper house, that is the Council of State, and it had a tenure of 5 years, and the lower house, that was Legislative Assembly, it had a tenure of 3 years. You must remember this thing. They are analogous to our Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha of today. So you must remember that bicameralism was introduced in the Government of India Act 1919. 3 members in the Viceroy Executive Council were Indians from now onwards. This is an important point. In the last act of last Indian Council Act, only 1 member was introduced in the Viceroy's Executive Council, but now 3 members were introduced in the Viceroy Executive Council. Communal representation that was given to the Muslims in 1909 was now further increased towards Sikhs and the Christians. So this is also a very important point. It provided for Central Public Service Commission, and this was set up in 1926. So you must remember that a Central Public Service Commission, not the Provincial Service Commission, but only the Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926. The Provincial Public Service Commission was set up later. That will be discussing in the later act. It separated the provincial budget from the central budget. So this is also a very important thing, that the budget of provincial government and the central government was separated through this act. You must remember all these points. This act is very important, and every year one question is definitely asked from this act. The last act under the Crown rule was Government of India Act 1935. So let us discuss the features of this act in detail. Now some of the important features of Government of India Act 1935 are: first of all, it provided for the formation of All India Federation consisting of Federal List, Provincial List and Concurrent List. The residuary power was given to the governor. Now an important thing over here is that concurrent list has been added. While we have seen in the earlier act of 1919 that there was a provincial subject and a provision for central subjects, but this was an effort to make India into a federal nation, but this could not succeed as most of the provinces did not join this system. So you must remember that the system of federal list, provincial list and concurrent list was added in the act of 1935. Secondly, it abolished diarchy. As we have already seen that diarchy was, or the dual government was introduced in the act of 1919, where the subjects of the provinces were divided into transferred and reserved subjects, where the reserved subjects were governed by the governor as well as the governor and the executive council. But that system was abolished and the provinces were given provincial autonomy. Now the governor had to take the advice of ministers in all the subjects. This system was started in 1937 but was stopped in 1939. So you must remember that double government, dual rule or diarchy was introduced in 1919 and it was abolished in 1935. Next is introduction of bicameralism in the provinces. So these two acts, that is Act of 1919 and Act of 1935, they are very confusing, because in 1919 bicameralism was introduced in the Central Legislative Assembly or the Central Legislative Council, but over here the bicameralism was introduced in the provinces also. So you must remember this thing, that in provinces it was introduced in 1935, while in case of center it was introduced in 1919. Secondly, it abolished the Council of India. This Council of India was established by the Act of 1858, but now it was abolished. 10% of the population got voting rights. It also had provision for establishment of Federal Court and RBI. These were subsequently established. It also set up the Provincial Public Service Commission. The Central Public Commission provision was given in 1919, but this had the provision for Provincial Public Service Commission also. So you must remember this point also. 80% of the budget was still non-votable. So you must remember that 80% of the budget was still not votable. So these are the important points of Government of India Act 1935. Please go through these both acts very carefully, that is Act of 1919 as well as 1935, because they are little confusing. So be very careful regarding the details of these two acts. Apart from the topics covered till now, there are some miscellaneous topics that have been left out. These are: there was a communal award which was started by Ramsay MacDonald in 1932. This is a very important topic because it was the base for Pune Pact. So you must go through this. You must remember this, that the communal award was started by Ramsay MacDonald in 1932. You will be reading about it in detail in the history section. Next was the Simon Commission. Simon Commission came to India in 1927. It had 7 members and all the members are Britishers. So what happened was there was mass agitation against this Simon Commission, and the tagline was Simon Go Back. So this was a very important movement in Indian history. This will also be discussed in the history section. Now what happened was that this Simon Commission in the end gave its recommendations in 1930, which were incorporated in the Act of 1935. For example, it gave the recommendation of abolition of diarchy. So this recommendation was incorporated in the Act of 1935. So many other recommendations were also incorporated. So this is also a very important commission. You must remember the date and when were its recommendations submitted and incorporated in which act. Next was that the Diwani was given to the company after the Battle of Buxar in 1764. So this question can come, that when was the Diwani given to the company. So you must remember that it was given after the Battle of Buxar in 1764. Now these are some of the important questions which can come in the exam. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the important questions. You must go through the video very carefully and note down each and every point, but still these questions will actually give you an indication of the kinds of question that can be asked in the exam. And if you go through the whole video very carefully, you will be able to answer most of the question asked from this chapter in the exam. So please pause the video and just have a look at this question and see if you can answer all these questions after going through the video. So read each and every question and try to answer them. After the Crown Rule comes the Indian Independence Act of 1947. I will be taking this act in a separate video because this is itself a big topic and it will take some time to be discussed. So I will be giving a separate video on this topic. Thank you for watching this video. I will be uploading more videos of Indian polity and will be covering the whole syllabus in my videos. Please like my Facebook page En Route IAS if you like my videos. You can also subscribe my channel on YouTube, that is En Route IAS. My website is enrouteias.com, and if you have any personal question you can directly email me on varunsharma398@gmail.com. Also I am also putting a list of books that are very important for prelims exam, and this list has all the subject, so you can directly click on the links and you will be directed to the Amazon website. From there you can buy the books at good prices, and these books will cover all the syllabus of the prelims exam. So thank you once again for watching my video. Please share my video and also subscribe to my channel En Route IAS. Thanks a lot.